Now, thank you very much for staying with us. We are just in time for the conversation here on the Spotlight. And as we know, flooding has been a mess or has caused havoc across the country for a few weeks now. And, we've lost a lot of lives to the flooding situation. In Maimayu, Naivasha, Nakuru County alone, over 50 people have lost their lives to the flash floods witnessed in that part of the country, with at least 30 people still not known where they are. The whereabouts of at least 30 people still remaining unknown. Now, for each and every Kenyan, the concern is what happens. What happened to the people living in those areas when that situation, or rather the flash floods, hit Maimayu, Naivasha, Nakuru County, and even everywhere across the country. But what about those with special needs? Because, as we all know, it's basic common knowledge that for someone who's, well fit and has no disability or any form of, whatever thing you'd, want to link to being disabled or able differently, you can rescue yourself. You can try and, go about things. But for someone who is able differently, or rather living with disability, it might prove to be a bit of a challenge. Now, what is the situation? What is the government doing to ensure that their plight is addressed and life is made a bit comfortable for them? Joining me this particular night to, of course, talk about floods and PWDs is nominated Senator Crystal ASIGE. Very many thanks, Senator, for joining us this particular evening.
Thank you for having me, Ian.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Now, Senator, the flooding situation has, been the main concern in the country for the past 1 month or so, and people are talking about, how thousands of Kenyans have been affected. Hundreds have lost their lives because over 220 people have lost their lives across the country to the flooding situation. Before we talk about, the plight of PWDs amid the flooding situation, from where you sit, how do you assess the, government response to the flooding situation in the country?
I think the government response has been slow. We even see today that the president only today went to visit Mathare, and that is, for me, descriptive or a display of how the government has been taking these floods and the issue of flash floods across the country. They have not acted quickly enough. It's been several weeks that we've seen heavy rainfall across the country, but it's only today that the president has actually gone to ground and seen people and spoken to people and assessed the situation. And I think that is an example of what's happening across the country in general. And unfortunately, we did not take heed from last year's El Nino and how that caused a lot of chaos across the country. I would have hoped that that would have been a really good preamble or a chance for us to get ourselves ready, disaster management ready, because anything can strike at any time. But unfortunately, that happened, and we saw how it ravaged the entire country in different places, how many people were displaced. Tana River, for example, was a huge disaster, but several months later, in 2024, we're still not ready, and I don't understand how that could be.
Now, the biggest concern has been, funds for, mitigating the effects of flash floods, El Nino. Those are debates surrounding the issue of funding from late last year. But let's just have a look at, for people living with disabilities. What is the situation of those living with disabilities with the situation as it is in the country as we speak?
Well, this is something that I've brought up on the floor of the House and the Senate, which is the lack of inclusive or disability-inclusive climate action or disability-inclusive disaster management. Unfortunately, just like you have said very rightly, when disaster strikes, it is worse 3 or 4 times fold for persons with disabilities. And because we are a very vulnerable group, the biggest vulnerable group in the country, we should also be taken into account in terms of disaster management efforts and mitigation of climate action programs and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, we still are forgotten. And when the budgets come, people with disabilities are not attached to the budgets. We're not prioritized in these budgets, even though we are disabled. We cannot help ourselves. We absolutely need intervention and very nuanced intervention and very specific interventions, because, for example, in Maimayu, they said that lots of people say that they first knew something was happening on that very first night several weeks ago, because there was a huge explosion and there was a big sound, right? A big crashing sound. Now, what do deaf people do in that situation? There are people who are deaf who did not hear that, who were not warned by this crashing sound, and therefore were caught up in the floods, in the flash floods in Maimayu. And I know of special needs persons, with disabilities who have autism, for example. And last month only was World Awareness for Autism, right? The month of April. And we keep telling the public that autistic people who are neurodivergent, are very vulnerable, more vulnerable than physically disabled, for example, because they do not have the social cues that other people who are non-disabled have. They are very prone to wandering, they are prone to losing sort of focus and things like that. So imagine in the midst of flash floods, an autistic person can get easily disoriented and not even know where they are, what they're doing, what's happening, where to go. And so there are all of these issues that really are not being looked into. And unfortunately, if the government are only responding, for example, today, and going to Mathare today, when will they now go and visit persons with disabilities who have been affected across the country?
Now, you've talked about, for example, someone who's deaf. How could that person have heard the, loud blast and whatever? Now, there's the issue of, assistive devices, because that is one key concern for, people living with disability. They talk about, it not being provided as it should. Yeah. Now, whose responsibility is that? And maybe what needs to be done from not only organizations that help people with disabilities, but most importantly from the government, because the government is responsible for each and every Kenyan. Someone who's living his normal life, or someone who's able differently. What needs to be done by the government to ensure that the safety of people living with disability is prioritized, especially during times of such natural disasters?
Unfortunately, at the moment, it's our international partners who are actually at the forefront of providing Kenya and providing persons with disabilities with assistive equipment and devices. We have no manufacturing plants here for wheelchairs. We don't have manufacturing plants for electric or sensory white canes or any other hearing aids, for example, and other devices of the sort. All of them have to come from outside. And when they come from outside, that has a cost implication and has tax implication as well, you see. And so right now we rely heavily, the entire disability fraternity rely heavily on foreign partners and organizations to come in and give aid in that way, or provide persons with disabilities through different avenues and programs and activities with these devices. Now, if the country and if the government were able to call on investors who make these assistive devices and bring them to Kenya, just the way they're bringing car companies to Kenya, the way they're bringing COVID manufacturers to Kenya, why not also think of persons with disabilities? Because this is a moment in times like this, natural disasters, that we really need those kinds of devices and support in that way, because a wheelchair user, the manual wheelchair is not going to cut it in the midst of flooding. How are they going to continue wheeling themselves through floods? You understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
So it's something that hasn't really been thought about. It's never been prioritized. And I think that there is no climate solution without disability inclusion. There just cannot be.
Now, fair enough. We talk about funding and resources. Before we talk about, who's supposed to provide these funds and where is the government, what is the government doing to ensure that funds are availed for to help people with disabilities? Before you get resources, you need to have the data. Now, as a country, do we even have data for people living with disabilities? Because the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics talked about somewhere around August 2023 talked about planning to do a survey and census for people living with disabilities this year. Yeah. Question is, has KNBS undertaken that particular initiative to ensure that we know, for example, we have 2 million or 2.5 million disabled people in the country?
So this has been a huge contention since the last census in 2019, because in 2019 they counted us at 960,000, around there, 0.9 million. In 2009 census we were at 2.2 million. So we actually dropped by over 400,000 between those two exercises. And we asked ourselves, why is it that our numbers are dropping? Population is rising, but people with disabilities numbers are dropping. That doesn't make any sense. It cannot. And so I actually had a meeting with the DG for KNBS just 2 weeks ago, and we had this discussion very in depth, and I was very candid with him, and I said, the survey that you want to undertake, which is what you're talking about now, it is way overdue. And what are we supposed to do so that we can go down to not just national level, but we go down to county level, we go down to ward level even, and figure out in every single village, every single ward, how many people with disabilities are there? Because it's at times like this that we need that kind of data. So that when we're looking for interventions, we are thinking of disability inclusive disaster management interventions, you see. But if we don't have the numbers of who is in which village in Chonyi, in Kilifi County, how many people with disabilities are there, then we cannot go and support or even look after our persons with disabilities. So yes, data is extremely crucial, not just for budgetary allocations and equitable budgetary allocations when it comes to the BPS. Like right now, National Assembly are putting together budgets for the next financial year, what will go where, who will get what. But if we are not properly counted, then we will not count.
Now, would you term whatever the situation that PWDs are facing at the moment, or would you attribute that to the failure of the legislative arm of government rather over the past few years to ensure that people with disabilities are well catered for?
I would blame everyone, to be honest. Yes, it does start from the top, because when the captain says this is a priority for us as Kenyans, inclusion is a priority, diversity, equity is a priority, if that comes from the very top, then yes, that will cascade all the way down, right, in every single level. But unfortunately, if that doesn't come, that sort of goodwill does not come from the executive and from all arms of government, then yes, we will continue struggling and singing the same song for years on end. I know that a CSO community as well as OPDs themselves, which is Organization of Disabled Persons across the country. Yes, we're making a push, but our voice is not loud enough, unfortunately. When it comes to fuel versus disability, fuel will win the conversation. When it comes to climate change and disability, climate change for non-disabled will win the conversation. When it comes to sugar and unga costs, those will win the conversation every single time. But nobody understands that every one of those conversations has an implication on people with disabilities, you see. We are in and part of every single one of those areas, all those socioeconomic matters. And so when we are not put on the table or given a seat at the table to discuss our issues, stakeholders are not brought on board to create strategic plans, to be part of conceptualizing different interventions, then yeah, we'll get left behind. And then one day the president or the government will stand up and realize, oh my goodness, there's this, our biggest minority group, we haven't actually done much for them in the last X amount of time that we've been in power. So I really think that there is an opportunity, to be honest, for right now, for them to take it seriously now, for us to be taken seriously as people with disabilities, not just as a by the way or an other. On a form you have like this tick and at the bottom other. We shouldn't be an other. We shouldn't be right there, part and parcel of every single conversation of development. Otherwise, we continue to be left behind.
Now, I talked about the legislative bit because the National Special Needs Policy of 2009 is yet to be ratified. It's been there since around 2006, so 15 years. Now, who is to be blamed for even for such a policy? Because this is a policy that is very crucial, and this is not the only policy, because the government spokesperson Isaac Mwaura a few days ago talked about the disability bill that is seeking to exempt parents of children with living with disabilities from paying income tax.
That's my bill. That is actually my
bill. It has been
yes.
stagnating.
Mm-hmm. It hasn't, well, it's been stagnating before I came into Parliament.
Yes.
Yes, it was something that had been discussed and pushed in the last term of Parliament, but it lapsed, unfortunately. And I believe that Isaac Mwaura was part of the people who were really pushing for the same, but it lapsed. And then when I came into Parliament in 2022, that has literally been all I have I've been waking up night and day, fighting tooth and nail to push that bill through. And right now it's in the National Assembly already. Within less than a year and a half, it's already in the National Assembly being considered, and after that it goes to the President for ascension. And right now National Assembly is on recess, so we can't do anything about that at the moment. However, when they come back from recess at the end of this month, then we continue that push. But what I will say about legislation is that that PWD bill, I have done so much to improve it, so much more community engagements, PWD forums, saying, hey, let's come back to the table because this bill is for us and it should be by us. It shouldn't just be by one person, the sponsor of the bill, Crystal ASIGE. No, it should be an inclusive effort, because I'm somebody who completely champions for inclusivity. So why would I not take on board every single situation so that we have provisions for every single matter? For example, what you've just said about parents and caregivers, that has never been considered before. In the last term, it had never been considered. There were no provisions which saw or catered to parents and caregivers with disability, but I've put that in. There was no provisions that catered for neurodiverse community. That means people who are autistic, who have Down syndrome, who have cerebral palsy, for example, and so on and so. They were not even recognized in the bill. It's only mostly physical, mental, and then sensory, which is hearing and sight. So there are many things that I have added to the bill, and I think that's why right now there is more of an injection of the momentum, let me say, as a real momentum that's going on within our fraternity and also out with the general public, because I have hopefully injected more of an urgency to put this bill into law, because we're suffering without it. And also we have seen through these last few weeks of the flooding, it's a prime example of how we're suffering. The more we go without legislation, the more we suffer, you see, and time is not waiting. The weather is not waiting, climate change is not waiting, and we need a legislation in place that will support us and give us provisions, clear provisions, so that when somebody, if a bridge or a road or a building is not accessible to persons with disabilities, a hospital, for example, facility cannot be accessed because of the physical inaccessibility, then my bill says that we will rip it down. Either you pay 2 million shillings or we rip that building down. Simple. Do not even ask us for sorries. We don't want any more. We're not requesting. This is our human right.
Now, before you talk, because you've spoken about the disability bill. Before we talk about your other bills in Parliament. Now, you've talked about caregivers. The disability bill talks about ensuring that parents of children living with disabilities are exempted from paying income tax. There's the issue of caregivers, because there are those who take care of people living with disabilities, but they're not their parents, if you'd say that. Yeah. They're suffering from a lot of issues. There's not only the issue of debate surrounding whether they should also be exempted from this income tax if that bill sees the light of day, but also there's the issue of mental health, because it is overwhelming for some of them. How can such an issue be addressed? The issue of caregivers and mental health, ensuring that they're well mentally, because sometimes it could be overwhelming.
Well, the bill does already recognize parents as well as caregivers. So long as you can show that you are the primary caregiver, whether biologically or otherwise, to a person with disability, then you are covered by this particular tax exemption. So you can be an auntie, a neighbor, so long as you have legal guardianship over this person with disability, then that provision will support you. Now, there is the Mental Health Act, which was passed by a senator in the last parliament. And that also speaks to mental health facilities for persons with disabilities, for the community around PWDs as well, that can get support in different facilities. So this particular bill is supposed to be focused on interventions for persons with disabilities and the issues that they go through, immediate issues, right? And the mental health bill, which is separate from this bill, then takes care of mental health issues, issues of anxiety, issues of depression, things of the sort, so that those two issues are not conflated into one. They have their own legislation that deals with them.
Now, before we wrap up the conversation surrounding, floods and, PWDs, it would only be fair for me to ask you, if you were to address the president today, what would you tell him in terms of, ensuring that PWDs are well catered for in terms of, such disasters, and as well in terms of funding? What would be your message to the president?
I would tell the president of Kenya, take people with disabilities more seriously in terms of prioritizing them, their needs, and the interventions that will be put in place to support them. I would also tell the president that we need more inclusive climate action mitigation measures in the country, rapid response measures in the country for people with disabilities. When a flood, for example, happens, a flash flood in any part of the country, do authorities and healthcare facilities and police and all of the rest understand, okay, this is the way we respond to non-disabled people, but this is now the way we respond to people with disabilities, and those are two very different approaches. That's what the president has to also, I would say, focus on prioritizing. I'd also say bring people with disabilities onto the table. When you are strategically planning for the next week, 2 weeks, 1 month, 2 months, trying to figure out how we're going to deal with the issues and the effects and impacts of the floods, even after the floods are finished. Because after the floods are finished, yeah, the land will be dry, but our houses will still be crushed. We'll still have lost all of our assistive devices to water and so on and so forth, damage and all. How are you getting people with disabilities on the table to then give you their views and their interventions that will suit their needs, you see? You don't just say we're planning for you, but you just sit on the corner somewhere, we'll plan for you and we'll tell you. No, you've got to bring us on the table, because otherwise you will be just futile in your efforts. So those are some of the things that I would say. And then also I would encourage the government, the executive, specifically the president, to ensure that we understand that there are vulnerable groups within PWDs. There are PWDs, I'll tell you, who are male, but their women and girls with disabilities even go through more. We have to have more disability responsive measures to these kinds of situations, and not just floods. Let's not think forward, let's think ahead. Let's think droughts. So because we've gone through droughts in the past as well, and people with disabilities also suffered. So these kinds of things have to be accounted for and looked into and planned for in advance. Don't be reactive, be proactive, is what I would tell the president.
Pretty much. Now, Senator, let's talk about your two other bills, the Kenya Sign Language Bill and the Learners with Disabilities Bill. Now, generally, what is the envisioned goal for you through these two bills?
The vision for me with these two bills and any other bills that I touch at all is to increase inclusion of persons with disabilities in society, in different areas of Kenya, of the Republic of Kenya, different sectors, different industries, things like that. And the Kenya Sign Language Bill seeks to, first of all, bring sign language education within the curriculum across primary school level institutions, so that every single child in primary school can at least have a basic understanding of sign language. So when you grow up as a 5-year-old to 10 to 15, when you grow up to be 20 and so on and so forth, you at least have some basic knowledge, and therefore when you interact with a person who is deaf, then you are able to communicate at least. It'll really make a huge difference in terms of including this particular group of people who are the deaf community. Also, I'm saying in the KSL bill that we need to have sign language not just on the news, like we have here today on Lookuptv, but we also include it in judicial systems, for example. In government services, when someone goes to Huduma Center, there should be sign language interpreters right there to support them. In hospitals, in police stations, okay? Like right now, during the floods, I've heard of cases of people who are deaf who go to the police station to look for support and they can't even communicate. People who are deaf who go into hospitals and they can't communicate because there's no medical practitioner who understands how to sign. So you see, we have these twofold issues that we have to deal with. So that's kind of the thing that some of the provisions of the Sign Language Bill. And in the Learners with Disabilities Bill is seeking to move away from traditional and segregated education into more inclusive education. So I'm saying you should not put special needs schools, like I said, don't put us on the side and then have non-disabled children on one side. It should have to be integrated, because that's how the world works. When I go from college to now the workforce, I won't just be with blind people. I'll be with Ian, I will be with other people, you understand? Yes. So that's the kind of way and the world that we need to move into, an inclusive society, an inclusive education. And that's what part of the bill, most of the bill now seeks to move from traditional education to inclusive education, which means let's have more support teachers within schools. Let's have SLIs, sign language interpreters within schools. Let's have therapy sessions inside of the school. Like the nurse, you know how you have a nurse's office? Also that nurse's office should be able to support in therapies for people with disability, like speech therapy, physiotherapy, things of the sort, so that our parents don't have to leave work, take a whole day off of work, which means losing income, and then go to the school, pull the child out of school, take them to Kenyatta Hospital for a therapy session, sit in a long queue. And in Kenyatta, by the way, therapy happens only like about once a week minimum. That's once a week, and if you miss it, you miss it, because doctors are on the clock, and even now there are no doctors. Yeah. Correct. So now what do we do? What are those kids doing? There have been 50 children with disabilities who have died since the doctor strike began.
No, Senator, even as we wrap up the conversation, from what you're saying, and from the conversation even going on in the country, inclusivity seems to be the main issue, because if that can be solved, then we'll have made a big stride in ensuring that PWDs are well catered for.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and inclusivity is not just about people with disabilities. It's about everyone. It's what we've been doing for ages. We've been trying to get, for example, away from tribalism and move into, what, you are just a Kenyan, I am a Kenyan. Sindio, najivunia kuwa Mkenya, not najivunia kuwa what are they. That's inclusivity, for example. Trying to decrease the pay gap within genders. That is inclusion as well. Trying to get more women in parliament. That is also inclusion, you see? So it's happening in every other sector. But with disability, we're really slow to get to that point, unfortunately. But what I'm saying is we need to be inclusive in all industries and all sectors and all areas, so that our country can be the kind of country that stands up for everyone, not just for some.
Now, finally, Senator, what would be your view in terms of whatever is happening in the country? You've talked about doctors. The doctors' strike today entered day 54. Even as you wrap up and give us your parting shot, how would you assess the situation in the country in terms of more specifically how the government has handled the issue of doctors?
Again, we are not proactive. It seems to be a very reactive government, and I don't know why. Because they asked for this job in 2022 and they got the job. We don't know how they got the job. That is still pending, a big question, but they got the job nevertheless. And now, instead of being proactive and being forward-thinking and progressive in how they run this country, they're very reactive. They wait for something to happen and then they're like, oh, let's talk about it. Let's see what we can do now. Unfortunately, that's not going to cut it, because there are over 55 million people in the country who are looking for leadership. Leadership, to me, in my view, leadership does not create followers. You're a leader who should be creating other leaders. And the way you do that is supporting these people, supporting your countrymen, and not letting them languish in poverty, letting them languish in bill of above bill, and then say on top of that, oh, okay, now we're not too sure what's going to happen with the rains. You just move to higher ground, save yourself. That is not a government that is responsive. That is a government that is moving responsibility to the Kenyan. Even having something simple like alerts on the phone that are in formats that are accessible to every single Kenyan, phones, texts that say, this is where the next heavy rainfall is going to come, do this, try and do this, get this done, here is the emergency number. We're not seeing it, and it's impossible to see how Kenya is going to really come out of this without any scathes.
No, thank you very much. It would be unfair for me because there's a viewer asking your two bills, the KSL, Kenya Sign Language Bill, and the Learners with Disabilities Bill. What stage are they in?
They are also in the National Assembly right now. So learners with disabilities, persons with disabilities, and KSL are all in they passed unanimously in the Senate in February this year, and then that means that they have to go over to the other house, which is National Assembly, for them to now also scrutinize and then go for the vote. So I am saying that wherever you are, ask your area senator, your area MP, your MCA to look into the bills and to push for the enactment of them.
Well, thank you very much, Senator, for joining us this particular evening. You're doing an incredible job, and of course, all the best as you continue, advocating for people able differently in the country.
Thank you very much, Ian.
Always a pleasure. Now, that was Senator Crystal ASIGE joining us this particular night to talk about matters people living with disability, not only with the flooding situation, but the situation generally across the country. Thank you very much. That was a conversation for you this particular night. Until tomorrow, do have yourself a wonderful night, and like always, God bless.
We value your feedback and welcome your complaints about our programming and operations. Feel free to get in touch with us through 0700 893 542 or send us an email to info@lookuptv.co.ke.